All right. Hi, everybody. I am Denise Mallon. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Investigative Reporters and Editors. And welcome to this session. This is a partnership between IRE and the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I believe this is our first event that we have produced together. And we're very excited to partner with the Institute on this session and to hear from this panel today of rock stars in the press freedom area. And to hear about this topic and have this discussion, because this topic really seems to be getting more important every day, and press freedom all over the country and all over the world as well. So we hope that you all out there find this session inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists today. So let's go ahead and dig in. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Angela Greiling Keane. Hi, Angela.
Good morning. Thanks, Denise, and welcome everyone on behalf of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. We're looking forward to a great conversation today, and we know that you and our audience will have questions too. So please feel free, starting now, to add them to the Q&A queue at the bottom of your screen at any time, and we'll take audience questions throughout our hour of discussion. I'm pleased today to welcome our panelists. We've got Amanda Bennett, the former director of Voice of America, Anya Callamard, United Nations Special Rapporteur, and Nabiha Syed, who's president of the MarkUp. We're here today to talk about investigative journalism. Investigative journalism, I assume I don't need to tell any of you here, is more important than ever today. And also today, more than ever, powerful forces around the world are seeking to prevent journalists' access to information. So I'd like to start with a question to the whole group to frame our discussion today. What do you think is the biggest threat to investigative journalism right now? Let's start with Amanda.
So, I think I'm going to hold down a slightly different corner than the other panelists, because I think they will have some much more dramatic examples than I will. Because I think the greatest threat to investigative journalism right now is speed and the lack of tenacity, because so much of investigative journalism, even before this period, required so much pushing, so much legal help, so much patience, so much time. I mean, I'm just looking back at probably one of the most dramatic pieces of investigative journalism that we did at Bloomberg News, and I'm sure you'll remember it when we sued the Federal Reserve Board. I went back and looked, that took 4 years. And so the situation is developing right now with pushback and legal problems and legal issues around the world and problems in governments around the world. It's going to require more of that and not less. So I'm going to hold down a corner of a much more traditional piece of journalistic tactics. So I think other people are going to have more dramatic examples than me.
Good, thank you. Nabiha.
You're right, I will have more dramatic examples, because I refer to this moment as having the 4 horsemen of the press freedom apocalypse. So there's lawfare, violence, mistrust, and something I'll call the snuffer, which I'm sure we'll get into later in the examples. But it's really about the moment that we're in and the interplay between them. We'll get into examples, I'm sure, throughout the hour, but one thing that's exacerbating all of those factors is the business model of investigative journalism. To Amanda's point, it is slow, meticulous, painstaking work. It has different types of returns than something that can, make, well, these days, pennies on ad dollars. And it does require, it takes a village, including lawyers, including editors, including reporters, accessing data, all of that. And so I think a business model that doesn't create the space for this intensive work is going to exacerbate the problems of violence, the problems of heavy litigation, the problems of sort of society-wide mistrust. And that's something that really requires a lot of our attention.
And Agnes?
Yes, thank you. I think to me the biggest problem at the moment is a normative counter-revolution that we are witnessing. And by this I mean the sustained attacks against values or norms that we thought had been well internalized, including in so-called old democracy. And what we are discovering is actually they were far more superficial than we were expecting. The attacks are coming from leaders, political leaders, intellectual leaders, and are therefore making the attacks far more impactful. It's not just an attack on norms, such as the First Amendment or press freedom. It's also an attack on the concept of fact and the concept of truth. Our world is one where it has never been so easy to contest what we would have thought was uncontestable. And that normative counter-revolution is fed by democratically elected leaders. It is fed by people that have been referred to in the literature as polarization entrepreneurs, who feed on the echo chambers of this new technology and internet, who dehumanize, who create a threatening environment and undermine the values that investigative journalism has placed on truth and fact. And so, you know, the implication of all of that is, of course, the absence of an audience or the undermining of the work before it is even being produced. And to me, that counter-revolution that we are experiencing is one of the biggest threats to investigative journalism.
Now
And Angela, can I just go back for a second, because I completely agree with everything that both Nabiha and Anya said. I just had a conversation this morning with a colleague. I'm going to, again, hold down a different corner and take these big things and try and keep taking them down to someone who is one person or a person in an organization and saying, and yes, the things that you're saying are so huge, so gigantic, so global. And I mean, I think there's a temptation for all of us to say, there's nothing I can do about this. This is all pressing down on me. And so I'm going to keep pulling it back to something that's going to sound very pedestrian, very plebeian, very ordinary. But what I want to give people in the audience who are trying to practice this is some place to believe they're doing something, some place to do something, because otherwise I think we could fall victim to being victims and feeling helpless otherwise, because you're right. And yes, it's huge. 4 horsemen, I think there's a dozen horsemen. I think there's 1,000 horsemen. I think the world is filled with horsemen, but I need to figure out where is a corner that I can stand and a place I can lead people that look to me for guidance to say, what should we be doing?
Now, playing off of that, none of you mentioned the Trump administration on your list of threats, but clearly the factors that you laid out, Agnes, and that you amplified, Amanda, are at play here in the United States as well as in many other countries right now. Following on that thread, the Washington Post recently reported that the White House is building a, quote, very large dossier on the newspaper's reporter, David Fahrenthold, who most people here probably know has done a series of investigative work going back many years, including reporting on Trump in the White House as well as his years before he was president. What do you think, to what extent do you think that President Trump's rhetoric and actions have enabled or fueled repression of press reporting here in the US, as well as the repercussions overseas? Let's start with Anya in that, given your area of expertise, but I'd be curious in the other panelists' thoughts on this question as well.
Well, I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that when democratically elected leaders hold such position and use their platform to propagate, you know, things that cannot but be described as lies, and feed on people's fear, that has incredibly large impact. Of course, the attack on the press and on fact is not new. There has always been people, you know, seeking to attack journalists. What is currently the hallmark of our period is the fact that, first of all, we have leaders espousing those views and using their election, their political platform, the White House in this case, to reinforce such views. It is having an incredible effect in that it is legitimizing something that otherwise would have been fairly, existing, but in a corner. It is now a central stage in the debate, in the discourse, in it forcing people into a reactive position. It is forcing us to resist rather than to be proactive and to continue to build press freedom. So the fact that leaders around the world, and he's not the only one, there are a lot of leaders, elected leaders, who are using their election and their democratic position to attack press freedom. That to me is one of the striking feature of the era we are living. And it is happening at a time when they can use a technology that we have not come to control very well. It's a technology whose impact we are discovering almost on a day-to-day basis. It's a technology that can be used to polarize for great and unfortunately for very negative impact.
I'd love to build on that a bit. I think seeing the president say, oh, we're creating a dossier about this reporter, what it does, right, it plants that seed of mistrust. It says the reporter is the outsider. These are maybe bad people. It plants that seed of doubt, and those seeds they've been planted before, and there's a lot of aggressive gardening of that sort happening over the last 4 years. And that is, it is terrifying, because what it leads to, with that seed sprouts into, is, well, if those ones are bad, we have other ones come, allocates trust to a different place. And then, of course, I think Amanda said it earlier, it sort of puts this doubt. So if anything comes out of an investigation from the Washington Post, it's immediately cast with this cloud. Now, one thing, to take a page from Amanda's book of making sure that people don't feel totally despondent in this time, I think it's why it's so effective to have reporters doing a lot more audience outreach, connecting with people, saying, here's who I am, get to know me, because that's going to recreate the type of trust, or at least have a chance at doing it, the likes of which we used to see quite often when there was a lot of local news and you saw your local reporter at the grocery store and the city council meeting and what have you. And so I think it's deeply pernicious. I think there are roads and people who are actually well on that road of trying to build something up against it.
And
Amanda,
I'm sorry, you want to ask me a question before, or can I answer?
yes, I just wanted to build on a little bit and then take your answer on both parts. Amanda, of course, until recently you led VOA, which is government funded, but historically has not been politicized or used to promote US political messages, US messages of freedom and press freedom and so forth, of course. But talk about your experience executing investigative journalism and promoting press freedom around the world there, in the context of the question that you're about to answer as well.
It's funny, because those two things will coincide in a very unexpected way. Because I was coming into this thinking about the countries to which we broadcast, and the VOA and BBC are basically the free press in a good portion of the world. That's all there is. And for us, investigative reporting was a lot of what we were talking about, the business model and the hard, long thing. But it also, people were getting attacked and expelled and jailed, not for these long investigations, but for simply reporting the simplest of facts. And so for us, investigative reporting, what needed to be defended was actually much more along what Nabiha was saying. And so I would kind of pull those two things together and say, I think in some ways for us, the answer is actually exactly what you were saying, is to go back to the kind of ordinary model of things that connect more directly with the audience. And credibility for an audience comes from being able to say, I knew this was going on, and nobody would tell me about it, but here's the person that has told me, so they can put together what they see and what they feel. You remember the big rush of doubt about press freedom in China when that bullet train derailed and Chinese government said, oh, nobody was harmed. And the people there started tweeting from the scene saying, I'm looking at dead bodies. And so, you know, the combination of credibility and the people's own experience was really important in validating the journalists' perspective. So I put those two things very much together. So it's global and it's big and it's enormous, but it's also very small.
Now, one of the challenges that journalists face in this realm of what we're talking about is the source of information that they may choose to publish. As we saw with WikiLeaks in 2016, some of the information that journalists may be leaked is retrieved through state-sponsored cyber intrusions, yet sometimes information that comes via those channels is legitimate information and newsworthy. So I'm curious, as we're talking about this question of audience trust and investigative journalism, what do you weigh with the provenance of the information when deciding what to publish? Happy to start with either Amanda or Nabiha for that.
I'm happy to jump in there. I mean, I think it's such a fact-specific kind of inquiry. So at the MarkUp, we do a lot of data-oriented journalism, and there we spend a lot of time on the initial collection of the data. And that's, you know, everything from, do you file a public records request and get a data set, and then pause and think, who was actually collected in this data set? How did we get it? Is everyone who needs to be part of this actually represented? And who are the sort of ghost spots in the data set that we don't see? I think when you get something of unknown provenance in your secure drop, for example, which many investigative reporters do, you have to do that same, like, why might this be given to me? What are all the incentives that are here? And things that are sort of bread and butter for investigative reporters. I think what's very important is to communicate to the public that that is the process that we're doing. I don't think the public fully realizes that it's not just, oh, cool, we got this in our mailbox, let's just throw it up on the internet and go. And I think, you know, norms around that have also evolved quite aggressively in the last 5 years. Like, I think there was sort of a fast twitch muscle where people would get something, throw it up there. And now there's more like, hey, we've gotten this. We don't necessarily know the context, but here's the context we have. Help us report this out. To Amanda's point, tell us what you're seeing, what's going on. And so I think it is this orchestrated dance around verifying, being transparent about what you know and what you can't know, what your limitations are. That happens with every piece of journalism. Now, what does that mean? That means that it's slow. That doesn't you don't do that in an hour. That takes time. And one challenge that I really keeps me up at night is if you have another information operation happening in your ecosystem, whether it's propaganda or places that have a different approach to journalistic ethics, and they don't take that time, their narrative gets out and takes hold on those same tech platforms that Agnes was mentioning. And what do you do while you're like spending all this time to verify? And that absolutely keeps me up at night. I don't have an easy answer for that.
I think Agnes gave us a little bit of a clue to that, when she talked about these forces pushing us into opposition and resisting, and that actually gives those forces a lot more power than they deserve. I think another thing is what you're talking about is to determine what your values are, determine what your processes are, and stay there, and don't allow yourself to be pulled into something, because if you wind up pushing back against forces too much. I mean, there's obviously we've got to do a lot of pushing back on the forces, and there's many roles for that. But if you wind up living in that space, you're always playing defense. And I don't think that's a place you really want to be. I don't think you want to be playing defense. You may wind up being a little slower, but I think you're better off playing offense and doing a little more slowly than always trying to react to something.
Now, Nabiha, when you were at Buzzfeed prior to the MarkUp, you were part of the team that decided to publish the Steele dossier. I'm curious to hear about the lead up to that decision and the risks that you weighed to come to the conclusion to publish that document, or that series of documents that most other news organizations did not publish, but yet it's withstood legal challenges. And
yeah, sure. I mean, Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief at the time, now at the New York Times, I think has elaborated on this publicly better than I ever could. I was on the legal team defending it. But for those who are unfamiliar, Buzzfeed published a dossier containing salacious allegations of ties between the Russian government and Donald Trump. It is, I will pause, go back and read it now. It is fascinating to see what felt so salacious 4 years ago versus like what we know and what's out in the open today. But a pretty key fact for everyone involved was that the document had been circulating at the highest echelons of the government. People had been briefed on it. People had been considering and trying to fact check it and understand it. And we knew that other news organizations had it as well. And a lot of Ben's logic there was, in this time, if you just think back to what January 2017 felt like, the public needed to know that this was considered a live issue by people in the government at high levels. And that if we said, look, this is a thing that exists, we don't know the veracity of it, but we want you to know that it exists, right? That upfront transparency about what it is. That felt like that was serving the public who had been maybe hearing tidbits or observing and seeing journalism that had been filtered through the background knowledge of, yeah, there's some scuttlebutt around it. Now, upon publishing, Donald Trump had some choice words for us on social media, namely two, fake news. And BuzzFeed was sued by a couple of people. And this is, I want to go back to that sort of first horseman of the press freedom apocalypse, the lawfare aspect of things. We were immediately sued by the president's then personal attorney, Michael Cohen. We were sued by 3 Russian oligarchs who have more money than I know how to write on a piece of paper, meaning they can litigate for a very long time, and a Russian tech entrepreneur who sued us in Florida. BuzzFeed is based in New York. The detail of Florida was not lost on commentators, and it was not lost on us, because Florida is where Hulk Hogan sued Gawker, R.I.P. Gawker, because of that lawsuit. And so we're facing 3 very large lawsuits that sent quite the signal. The president, a leader disapproved. We could be embroiled in lengthy litigation that could expend the resources of a digital media outlet, and that someone was okay with signaling that they were fine if we lost it all. And that is quite a lot to have riding on a publication choice, right? That's different than everyone in the media disagrees, and like within a democracy, we have healthy discussions about what should be disclosed and what shouldn't be. It's you transgressed something that makes the president look bad, and so it might be lights out for you. That is a very, very threatening place to be. Now, we've had a lot of success in those litigations. Michael Cohen dropped his because he has bigger fish to fry, like his own life. And we litigated the others in court and did quite well. But that lawfare that we're seeing is something, I mean, Anya can expand on this, I think, for hours, I'm sure, where you see across the world. And we're seeing it continue with Nick Sandman, the Covington Catholic teenager suing every media organization you can imagine. And then the fanfare around those choices, right? If you go on these social media platforms, if you see the narrative in a particular sector of the media, there's like, yeah, get them. They're fake news, they deserve to die. And that is very, very chilling for reporters and editors. And so having been in the eye of that storm, I can tell you just how chilling it is, but I was really proud of our team for persisting through and for the courts to endorse that choice.
I'd like to go back to that because that's a really interesting case, because it reminds me of being at much smaller publications and having all the wealthy people in town suing us with, it reminds me of that same kind of polarity. What do you say? This is a big problem from the small level down to the high level. What do you say? What do you do if you are outspent, outgunned, outlegaled? What do you do?
Great question. So about 10 years ago, I started one of the first media law clinics in the country. It's at Yale Law School, and there's now a number of them across the country. So we recognize exactly the dynamic you laid out, which is particularly if you're a small shop, you don't have the money to fight this. You just don't. And so what are your choices in that moment? You either take it down and say sorry. You maybe don't publish it in the first place at all because someone's gotten a sniff of the story and they send you a nasty lawyer letter. Or if you do get into the litigation, you might run out of money. And so this ecosystem that's just evolving now, right, of legal clinics at law schools that are being funded by some major foundations. There's something called the Press Freedom Defense Fund that is being funded by Omidyar. These are opportunities, experiments in this space to recognize the dynamic. And I actually am really excited about the potential for this collaboration. I think it's taken us a couple of years to realize, oh yeah, no, this is going to be a team effort to fight the press freedom fight in the United States versus different organizations going at it alone. But I think we're seeing a coalition form of lawyers, of universities, of small papers, of the foundations and the individual donors that fund them to come together. And we haven't solved it yet, but we're in the midst of doing so. And I do take a lot of, it gives me a lot of optimism.
And Agnes, of course, you've spent much of your career fighting for the freedom of the press around the world, and you've investigated a much more, lawsuits are threatening, but you investigated a much more grave consequence of investigative journalism in the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And in a Washington Post opinion piece that you wrote after your investigation concluded, you called the verdict to acquit the two top advisors to the Saudi crown prince, quote, the antithesis of justice. What effect does his killing have on investigative journalism around the world?
Well, it's, you know, I will say it's far more ambiguous impact than one may think. Because by killing him, of course, the authorities were silencing a critique, someone who had established a very legitimate platform of dissent. But because of the reactions, because of the fact that 2 years after his killing, the issue remains on the agenda, that there are people around the world who continue to campaign for justice, because every time Mohammed bin Salman walks one step outside his country, someone is going to remind him of Jamal Khashoggi, because every time Saudi Arabia tries to invest somewhere publicly, there will be somebody fairly public who will talk about Jamal Khashoggi. I think for all those reasons, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi has actually completely backfired as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, and as far as the messages that he could have sent. I think it sent a message to the leaders of the world that if they're going to kill a journalist, they better be very and extra careful, because there will be people pursuing them in every single corner of the world, and nobody, even as powerful and influential as Mohammed bin Salman, can hide from our search for justice and from the search for truth. The fact that the international media community made his killing a cause célèbre and understood his killing to be the red line in the sand that never must be crossed again. And by fighting for Jamal, they fight for all other journalists who may not have his brand name. The fact that those, the international and national media have made it such a strong call has actually, you know, has had the impact that we need to look for, which is to demonstrate that this kind of repression and this kind of practice flourish under the silence and without scrutiny. And whenever there is scrutiny, whenever there are people speaking up, there will be a direct impact on the practice. The other example I want to highlight is that of Daphne Caruana Galicia, the investigative journalist from Malta, who was murdered a few months before Jamal, and who too has become a cause célèbre. And what the work that the family and civil society has shown is that when you investigate the killing of a journalist, so many more things unravel. Corruption within government, lies, external corruption. It has challenged the European Union. A prime minister has resigned. So for all those reasons, I think it is extraordinarily important not to let any act of killings against journalists go unchallenged, whether it's through the media or through a formal process of justice, because so many more issues will be uncovered. And that will have ripple effect for the health, the moral health of our society.
And what I like about these two answers is, again, I opened with saying, this stuff is so huge, you could easily feel like, I just want to pull the covers over my head, there's nothing I can do. And yet both of you are giving us answers to what can the people in the audience here who are looking at, who are by and large practitioners, they're individuals, what can you think about doing? What kinds of things ought you to be thinking about yourself in how, not just how you pursue your craft, but how do you look at these larger issues and where can you put some effort into doing this? The development of a network of legal support, incredibly important. The development of a global pushback. I loved your idea that, when he steps out of Saudi Arabia, there's always going to be someone there to push back on him. That's something that we can all participate in. It actually, the fact that both of you consider those things significant and important says to me that the small person's individual effort is not lost.
Absolutely.
Indeed, and while the consequences are fortunately not usually as grave as they were for Mr. Khashoggi, investigative journalists everywhere, in fact, journalists everywhere, face bullying, intimidation on social media and elsewhere, threats of lawsuits and more. I'm sure you couldn't find a journalist who didn't have an example of a nasty tweet. What advice do you have for journalists who are facing these sorts of actions, for preparing themselves, for steeling themselves, for carrying forward with their work?
Happy to jump into that one. I think it is just wise to take a moment and think about that before you publish, and not in a chilling effect way, but in a just like really honestly look at yourself in the mirror and think like, am I ready to go to the mat for this one? And I know that is a very, very hard thing to say to reporters who have poured their heart and soul into a particular story and it's about to go out the door, and that is a fraught emotional moment in its own right. I know, working closely with reporters. But really get yourself to the point where you feel confident. Now, for many, many reporters, they're actually not in an infrastructure or an ecosystem where they have a lawyer they can call. If you are lucky enough to be in that way, call your in-house lawyer, have them take a look at it. I'm sure they probably have. And then, rest easy with that. They'll find a way. If you don't have that kind of ecosystem, it might not be a bad thing to look out for that, to see, are there local clinics? Are there networks of media lawyers where I am in the United States? I'll bet you there are. If you're looking for something and you can't find it, you can always email me at president@themarkup.org. I'll connect you. Honest promise to everyone out there. Internationally, I'm less equipped, but you can Google around. And just be ready to defend your work. Make sure you feel comfortable doing that. And if you're not, understand that you're walking into an environment that's not always friendly to missteps and mistakes, and that kind of preparation will just do you a world of good.
And Amanda, I'd love to hear you on this as well. You've obviously spent many years as an editor in many different types of news organizations, but helping shepherd investigative projects.
Yeah, and different people's tolerance for risk and ability in their own personal lives to shoulder risk is different. And so I think there's many people for whom facing risk is an important part of their lives. And so those people will tend to gravitate towards investigative journalism. But there's others for whom, they can't right at this moment afford to do that psychologically for their family or whatever. And being able to understand which is really important. And I don't think most, as you talk about first time, or even once you've gone deeply into a story, necessarily can imagine what the consequences out there are. And I think you're right. I think imagining those consequences and saying, okay, I believe in this. I believe in what I've done. I believe in my craft. I believe in the way I'm living. I do believe that I may have to face this consequence, and I'm ready to do that. And even then, I don't think you're very emotionally prepared, but I do remember having to walk some journalists through and sit down and say, I don't think this is going to happen, But I do think there's a possibility you may have to spend a little time in jail as a result of this. Are you okay with this? Now go home and ask your spouse. Is your spouse okay with this too? Make sure you're okay with this. I don't think it's going to happen, but I want to make sure you understand. And for many, many people, they threw back their shoulders and they said, of course, this is what I live for. But some other people would say, no, I can't do that. And I think understanding that difference and being brave enough to understand, not just brave enough to face the risk, but brave enough to not face the risk. You know, I think both of those things are very important. And I think we have to do it much more than we did before. But honestly, I'm still talking about situations that happened more than a decade ago.
One of our audience members has a follow-up question on this topic. This person asked, should free press organizations and journalists be more aggressive in protecting themselves using the same tools as those who attack them? For example, should they be more open in bringing defamation suits against their aggressors if resources are available?
I don't belong to one of these organizations, and Nabiha, you'll have a much better answer than I do, but I always say that, you know, you fight the fight on your own battlefield. You know, if you fight with crazies using crazy, they can out crazy you. You know, I'm just not sure that adopting their tactics and depending on that is the way to go, because we're just not that good at it. But Nabiha, you may have a much different answer than I do.
No, I wanted to clap while you were talking. That's exactly right. I mean, I think, look, the situation, the environment we're living in changes month to month, sometimes day to day. So I'm not going to put any tactics off the table. But as a general principle, it is hard to out crazy the crazy. And then also you have to think about, where does that get you, right? So if we end up in a totally fractured news ecosystem where everyone only trusts like 4 people, and they all have their own, you know, news sources, and everyone sues everyone else for something they don't like. If you zoom out, what kind of like free press is that? What does that mean? What does that look like? And I it doesn't look so great to me. That seems kind of bleak. And so I think there's a lot of other work in terms of like investing directly in trust with audiences and communities, particularly a lot of communities that have felt excluded from the institutional press for many decades, rightfully so. There's a lot of building work to be done that I think is maybe a better use of our time than burning it down, which I very sympathize with the impulse. But there's a lot of building to do, and we have a real opportunity right now, and I think we should be focusing on that work.
I'm going to disagree, probably because I am European and we don't, you know, we don't see defamation as an absolute no-no, as it is tend to be in the United States. In fact, under international law, there is something recognized as a personality to be protected against lies in particular. A large number of women journalists have found themselves in situations where they had no other alternative but to sue for defamation because of the nature of the public lies and attacks that were made against them. And I have absolutely no problems about using a legal provision which is in place in all countries of the world, that has been used time and time again against journalists. It's nothing against turning the table when it is possible, and using that against those who do not hesitate to use their influence, power, platform to attack, harass, threaten, undermine, vilify, and so on and so forth, all of which are lies. You know, I think that the key point here are people using their influence to spread lies against someone, in particular female investigative journalists. And if they are, well, let's go for it 100%, through the law, through our own platform, through the media, and so on and so forth. There cannot be, the one thing that we cannot do is let lies go unchallenged, whether it's about one of us, or whether it's about the state of the right to health in the United States, or whether it's about the killing of a Black man by the police. Not one lie should go unchallenged. And that should apply to female or men journalists who are being attacked.
We have another question, particularly apt for our IRE audience, from somebody in our chat. She asked, how important is it to keep improving your skills as journalists attending courses, learning how to work with data and social science methods to make your reporting stronger and more difficult for political leaders to deny and call it fake news. I'd love for Amanda, as the editor of our panelists, to take this one. I know as an editor myself, I always love it when we've published a tough story and then the subject calls to complain about like some word choice in paragraph 32, or you can tell that the story is bulletproof if that's what they're complaining about. Amanda, what's your advice to this questioner?
Well, I had a kind of a rude response to that, which is, well, duh, yes, of course, that's what we do, absolutely. And Agnes, I totally am very much emotionally responding to what you're saying, because it does feel like in a lot of cases that's the only place you can go. But I think for our audience right now, this question speaks much more to the heart of what we should be doing, which is shoring up our own credibility and our own ability to, when you ask the question about, are you willing to go to jail for that, to throw your shoulders back and say, I know this is right. I know this is speaking to an important issue. I know I did the best job. I know I couldn't have done better. I know there's nothing in here that's wrong. So all those things speak to craftsmanship. So I do think that's really important. Again, I'm trying to speak to the individual practitioners, and yes, this is in no way to not say, like, when you're speaking, when you talk about like, I want to applaud, it's like, yes, I do want to speak up for the vulnerable people that are being targeted in the way you're describing. On the other hand, for most people, I think being able to improve themselves and build their credibility and build the credibility of their work is an exceptionally important piece of the puzzle.
Now, in your opening remarks, at least two of you talked about funding and the challenges that the bottom line poses for producing investigative journalism, which does take time and therefore is expensive. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on solutions for funding model for investigative journalism and how that can be done even as newsrooms across the US and around the world face funding challenges, particularly in this difficult economy.
$1 billion question that I that think about all day, every day. And the short answer is I don't know. The bigger answer is I think that we are in an amazing time of experimentation in this space. So we have everything from people looking at sort of membership approaches, saying, if you like us, if you like our work, please become a member, sort of like public media, but we're seeing a proliferation of those approaches. We're seeing people striking out on their own, saying, I have a newsletter, we can do this one-to-one kind of approach. People who are experimenting with business models that look more at like physical convenings and events, maybe not in a COVID time, but in another time that seems promising. And we, of course, the generosity and of philanthropy. And I think also in Europe and many other places, we do have state support, over here too, it's state support for public media and for different media. And so I think the answer is probably some mosaic of all of these choices, and we're trying to figure it out right now. And I think, just building on the last little exchange we had too, I think we're in a time where the rules are changing. So I am a defamation defense lawyer by training. So I would always look at defamation and be like, no. But as Anya's pointed out, there does come a time where you're like, this situation has gotten so bad that like responding in this way, this is the only way to stop harassment. When it comes to business models, I think there's a lot of people who want to believe that investing in more advertising is going to be the way forward, as it has been in the United States for some decades. And I think the time is to look at that tradition and say, yeah, that's not working the way we thought either. Let's experiment with something new. So we're in a moment of great experimentation, which is to say that if nothing is known, everything is possible. And I think that's both terrifying and should be heartening for the practitioners on this, on the call. You can experiment with a lot because no one actually knows the right answer for this.
And I'd like to add another little channel to this, and that is that, yes, and I've certainly run my share of, probably $1 million investigative projects, big ones that took a lot of money and a lot of time. But on the other hand, I want to make sure that everyone doesn't sell themselves short, because I just don't, because I'm not working anymore. I'm unearthing all my papers. I unearthed my application to my very first job as an investigative editor. And I remember the first sentence is like, I've never done any investigative reporting. And the next was, wait a second, yes, I have, because I've found things that nobody knew and put them out. And so I want to make sure that we all don't think of investigative journalism as exclusively these gigantic multi-person, multi-party, multi-year things. And I was the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and now in a funny circle of events from an outside philanthropy perspective, I'm back engaged with the Philadelphia Inquirer again. Now, I just heard this, and push back on me if anybody else would like to take credit for it, but at our last meeting, we were told that the issue with the post office and the mail came from an intern at the Philadelphia Inquirer who was looking into the question of a reader saying, why is my mail coming so slowly? And this intern decided to go and see, like, why is this woman's mail coming so slowly? And that strikes me as an investigative piece that was done by an intern, one person, over a very short period of time, and has had an enormous consequence. So don't sell yourself short, guys. You know, there's a lot of things you can do.
We're of course also in a moment of racial reckoning, and the spotlight has been on some newsrooms overwhelmingly white investigations teams. And as Amanda said, not all investigative journalism is done by full-time investigative reporters, but on those teams, the lack of diversity in some newsrooms has gotten some attention. What are some ways to make sure the teams that are doing the work and the subjects that they cover are diverse?
I think that this is a long overdue conversation, and so I am glad that it's happening in this moment. We have our investigative editor Evelyn LaRubia is Latina. To my knowledge, I think she's maybe the only at an organization funded at our level. And now I say that very specifically. I think there is an entire ecosystem of independent papers, of community papers, of individuals, to Amanda's point, who are doing amazing investigative work. And just because they don't have the right title behind their name or the right credential, we shouldn't be ignoring it. And so I think a really interesting way forward to diversify newsrooms is to look at the folks who are in fact doing the work that maybe in corners of the globe or corners of the country that you just haven't been paying attention to. There is a vibrant tradition of investigative journalism in the Black press. It's been happening, it's in those institutions. Maybe if you are at a bigger institution, this is an opportunity to have a partnership and help amplify those voices and that work in another way. I think that is an area that deserves a lot of exploration. I think often this conversation becomes a pipeline one of, oh, there just aren't enough people going to the right schools and having the pipeline into our newsroom. And I really, from my vantage point, that's wrong. That might be some part of it, but I think we should not ignore the amazing investigative journalism that comes from unexpected places, like an intern, as Amanda said, or in a community paper, or frankly, a local school paper. And really broadening our horizons and really looking at who is doing the investigative work and how can we make sure they have the right platform and are in all these newsrooms so they can bring their perspective is the way forward at the moment.
Well, you know, I'm going to be far more maybe direct. I am going to say hire more people from minorities, promote more people from minorities, of course, on the basis of competencies, promote and provide a more inclusive fact findings or investigative focus, be self-critical about, you know, how your background, your education, your privilege may impact on the way you're going to approach an issue, on the way you're going to interact with people. I mean, all of that to me are part of, and many more things, are part of constructing more inclusive newsroom. But it will require at some point to play a number game. It will require at some point to acknowledge that too many, you know, that the media scene is dominated by one kind of person, whether it's linked to race or to education or to other kind of a class background, and to challenge that. And I'm not saying it's going to be done quickly and overnight. I think I agree that we need to begin the conversation, but because it's so long overdue, talking about France, where you know, I can count on one hand the number of non-white journalists at you know, at any time during the daytime television or nighttime television for that matter. You know, this is a long overdue conversation in many countries, in many newsrooms, in many television stations, and at least speaking for France, it's got to be done quickly and forcefully, and you know, we just need more people that do not come from the same background, that do not all look the same, and so on and so forth.
You know, can I answer? And yes, Nabiha, is that okay? You know,
yeah, sure.
Here I'm going to disagree with you, Agnes, because I'm looking at the screen. I'm by far the oldest person on this call, and I'm going to take advantage of that fact. And that is that the conversation is by no means overdue. The conversation has been going on. I was part of a very dramatic, you know, racial equity hiring team 30 years ago, and the fruits of that we don't see. And I think the answer is, nobody's actually really taking it that seriously. You know, there's a burst when something important happens, and then it goes on. I also was part of the late lamented Knight Ridder chain, where they actually did hire, promote, recruit both women and minorities extremely successfully, and they took it seriously over a long period of time. It was part of my MBO, my management by objective. That was part of my pay, was I recruiting and promoting people of color, diverse news organizations. So I don't agree that the conversation is long overdue. I think we've been just having the same conversation that we have had over and over again, but it all happens in bursts at periods of time like this when there's attention on it, but nobody's actually taking it all that seriously. And I think if you want to take it seriously, Knight Ridder is one of the best examples of what happens to take it seriously. It works. It happens. There were top editors of papers all over the country of diverse you know, backgrounds.
I love that example, because Knight Ridder is something that we study a lot, or just to see how were they able to do it. I totally agree with that. I want to tease out one point too, especially for the folks on the call, is that it's not just about getting people into the room. It's about looking at the culture of those newsrooms to make sure that those people stay, make sure those people grow, make sure they ascend. And that culture, you know, if you're not consistently committed to it, you know, a consistent daily practice, not just the, you know, the bursts that Amanda describes, you know, folks know when you're doing something because it's in the news right now, and they know when you actually mean it and you show up. And that is a really deep institutional commitment that needs to be made. And that I'm optimistic, hopeful, I'm too optimistic sometimes, that organizations are doing right now. I will say for us at the MarkUp, I early on in our time reached out to some social scientists who have degrees in social bias, and said, hey, can you help me design evidence-based practices and policies in a handbook that puts equity and anti-racism at its core. Like we started doing this we launched in February 25th. I mean, we started doing this pretty early on. And one notable thing that one of these experts said to me was, you know, we only get brought in once something has gone horribly sideways. We've actually never had the opportunity to sit down with someone's handbook from day one and say, like, you know, see that thing, that's exclusive in this way. This is how that plays out in 15 years, and really help design from day one. And I think that sort of design and build work is really what we need to be doing in a consistent fashion to get to where we need to go.
And I was just laughing because I was just remembering to that about going sideways. I could remember it was in fact part of my salary that I do this. And I remember the person that was in charge of this coming to my newsroom, and I apologize for uttering the word, I can't find anybody. And the person looks at me and says, gosh, I'm so sorry that you can't find anybody. And it was pushing it right back on me, like, you're not trying hard enough. That wasn't an excuse. That was my problem.
I want to take a pivot to get in one really important topic that I'll, let's focus on Anya for this one. Jason Rezaian recently wrote about the deaths in prison of journalists in Egypt, Honduras, and Kyrgyzstan, all of whom likely died of COVID-19 after being detained for doing tough journalistic work. Here at the National Press Club and the Journalism Institute, we're following the case of journalist Hopewell Chinono, who has been jailed in Zimbabwe. And it's certainly not just authoritarian governments that are using the pandemic to assert their authority. We're seeing countries using COVID as cover for limiting freedom of the press in all sorts of places. But the imprisoning is, of course, of utmost concern. What can we do to ensure that these limits are truly temporary in time of pandemic, and make sure that they are lifted if and when COVID stops being, hopefully when someday, COVID stops being a daily threat?
You know, the first thing I have to say that most of those measures are unlawful. So we should not have to, we should not even expect them to be short term. We should be fighting against them, plural. A large number of governments are using the COVID-19 pandemic to repress expression, to repress anyone who dare critique their response to the pandemic. You've mentioned Egypt, the other countries that my colleagues have highlighted that the UN are Belarus, Cambodia, China, Iran, Egypt, India, Myanmar, and Turkey. All of those countries have been singled out for using COVID-19 to imprison journalists because of the work they were doing. There is absolutely no rationale for doing so. There is no lawful basis for the measure that were taken and the imprisonment. So the first thing that needs to be done is to denounce it and to to articulate what others have done already, which is the fact that there is the use of the pandemic, the misuse of the pandemic is actually backfiring for society as a whole, because most of those journalists are imprisoned, including for reporting on the problems with the response to the pandemic. That includes cases in China in particular. So the impact of imprisoning journalists in that context is actually probably more people dying. Put it very simply. And of course, it's going to be difficult, and I'm sure no investigative journalist will be able to make a direct link between the imprisonment and some of those deaths. But circumstantially, you can well understand that if people are not able to report on what's happening and on what journalists are doing wrongly, and on what states are doing wrongly, then the likelihood of people not knowing which measures they should take to protect themselves is very, very high. I want to use an old example here about famine. The research that have been done about famine by economists has shown that in countries where there is press freedom, there is no famine. There are comparisons that have been done between famine in Ethiopia and the beginning of hunger in India, for instance. And in the two situations led to very different outcomes because of the capacities of journalists to report and the capacities of people in general to speak up. So the implication must also be highlighted, must be spread out, and states must be called for what they're doing. And here we're talking about very powerful states. Nobody dares at the moment to stand up to China internationally, notwithstanding the US, to Egypt, including the US. No one dares challenging Egypt for its treatment of journalists and of freedom of expression. Very few people dare challenging India, except within India. So we are facing situations where states and governments are far too silent about the treatment against journalists. And it is up to people like you, to associations, and to people like me to spread the word and to insist that those journalists be protected and released.
Well, with that important call to action, we have unfortunately reached the end of our hour, which at least for me has gone very fast. I'd like to thank each of you here on our panel for your insight and time. I feel like we could continue this broad conversation for hours, but out of respect for everyone's time, we'll we'll stop today here. So thank you as well to our audience, as well as our audience who will be watching at IRE for spending time with us today. The National Press Club Journalism Institute is here to help you during this challenging time. We've waived all of our registration fees for programming since March in light of the coronavirus pandemic. So far, that's brought us savings of more than $52,000 for participants like you. We're hoping that you'll give our work a thumbs up with a donation in support of learning like this and the rest of our programming. We hope you'll complete a survey about your experience so we can design more programs that you and other journalists need most. You'll receive links to do both in an email shortly, and you'll also receive information on registering for the IRE conference, where this conversation will be shown more widely with a fresh new live chat. Stay well, and thank you for being here with us. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.